The morning my son moved to another country, his assistant called me before his plane had even landed and said, "Mrs. Renford, I'm so sorry, but if I wait any longer, there may be nothing left for you to protect." Hi, dear friends. When the warning comes from the assistant, not the son, you already know something rotten is buried deep. Tell me where you're watching from. I was standing in my kitchen with a paring knife in one hand and half a Bartlett pear in the other. At 76, I keep to my little rituals. I warm the teapot first. I fold the linen towel twice. Never once. I leave the radio low. That morning, it was Debussy, soft as mist, and I remember thinking the day looked almost too elegant to turn ugly. The light was falling across my counters in long golden stripes, and a cardamom loaf had just come out of the oven. Damien used to love cardamom when he was a boy. Funny what the heart remembers, even when it should know better. He had left for Lisbon that morning. A fresh chapter, he'd called it. International clients, better tax climate, stronger positioning. My son had a way of turning greed into vocabulary. For 20 years, I let him handle nearly everything after my husband, Alistair, died. Investments, trusts, property proceeds, retirement income. If there was a signature needed, Damien arrived with tabs already placed and a fountain pen in hand, all patience and polish, saying, "I've simplified it for you, Mother." I believed him because grief makes you tired, and tired people hand their lives to the nearest calm voice. When my phone rang, I nearly let it go to voicemail. Unknown number. London prefix. I answered only because I thought Damien might have changed phones at the airport. "This is Evelyn Renford." A woman inhaled shakily on the other end. "Mrs. Renford, my name is Noelle Harrow. I'm your son's executive assistant. I know this is inappropriate and I may lose my job for doing it, but I need to ask you something before he realizes I've looked." I set the knife down. Looked at what? There was a pause. Office noise in the background. A printer. A door closing. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "At the Evergreen Reserve account." I frowned. "My reserve account?" "Yes, ma'am." The name meant nothing to me, and that was the first chill. Damien named every account like it belonged in a private members club. Alderbridge, Halcyon, Wintermere. Evergreen could have been one more polished label in his neat leather folders. "What about it?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "According to the client reports you were sent, it should be holding a little over 1.8 million. My fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. And? It doesn't. The room seemed to narrow. Even the music felt far away. I looked through the window above the sink at the hydrangeas in my back garden, blue and motionless in the sun, as if the whole world had decided to stand still while one sentence ruined mine. "How much is in it?" I said. Noelle answered so quietly I almost didn't catch it. $42,611. I actually laughed, not because it was funny. Because the number was so absurd, my mind rejected it on impact. "You must be mistaken." "I hoped I was," she said. So I checked the quarterly archive, then the transfer logs, then the fee ledger. "Mrs. Renford, I don't think your son was only moving your money. I think he's been draining it." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the pear still waiting on the board, the loaf cooling untouched, the whole house suddenly feeling like a stage set for a life I no longer trusted. "Send me everything," I said. Her breath caught. "Then you do believe me?" "No," I said, staring at the steam curling from my teacup. "But I believe numbers. And if my son has been lying to me for 20 years, today is the last quiet morning he gets. I did not move for a long time after the call ended. The tea went cold beside my hand, untouched, a thin film forming on the surface like something quietly decaying. At 76, you learn to sit with discomfort. You don't rush to conclusions. You let the truth come to you in its own time. But that morning, something inside me already knew. This wasn't confusion. This was architecture. For 20 years, my son had been building something around me, and I had mistaken it for care. After Alistair died, everything became paperwork. Death is not only grief, it is signatures, accounts, decisions you are expected to make while your hands are still shaking. Damien stepped in before I even knew I needed help. He was calm, organized, gentle in a way that felt professional. He brought me folders labeled in soft gray tabs, spoke in clean sentences, and never once raised his voice. "Let me handle this, Mother. You shouldn't have to worry about these things." I remember the first document I signed under his guidance. It was in my study, in the cedar-scented room where my husband used to read in the evenings. Damien placed the paper in front of me, turned it slightly so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk, and handed me a pen I didn't recognize. Heavier than mine, lacquered, deliberate. "It just gives me flexibility to manage things efficiently," he said. Flexibility. Such a harmless word. I signed. That was how it began. One permission, then another. Then a restructuring to reduce tax exposure. Then a consolidation to simplify oversight. Each step sounded reasonable on its own. Each signature felt like a small relief. And slowly, almost elegantly, everything moved under his control. I still received reports, of course. Beautiful reports. Cream-colored paper, embossed headings, numbers arranged in neat columns with reassuring growth curves. He would walk me through them over tea, pointing lightly with his finger. "You're very well positioned," he would say. "Conservative, but strong." And I believed him. Not because I understood every figure, I didn't, but because I trusted the voice explaining them. That is the dangerous thing about trust. It doesn't require proof. It replaces it. I stood up eventually and went to the hallway closet where I kept my documents. Not the polished folders Damien gave me. My own records. Old tax returns, property sale agreements, insurance letters. Things I had insisted on keeping even when he told me everything was digitized now. The box smelled faintly of dust and lavender sachets. I carried it to the table and began opening folders one by one. My movements were slow, precise. Not panic. Inventory. Alistair's workshop sale. I remembered that clearly. Damien had insisted on reinvesting most of it. "Idle capital loses value," he said. The number from that sale was engraved in my memory. I found the original statement. Then I found the first allocation summary Damien had prepared months later. The numbers did not match. Not dramatically. Not enough to alarm someone glancing over it. But enough. I pulled another file, then another. Dates. Transfers. Percentages. Little adjustments that leaned in one direction. Away from me. A pattern. By the time I reached the bottom of the box, the house felt different. Not unsafe. Just revealed. As if the walls had been listening all these years and were finally ready to speak. My phone lit up again. A message from Damien. "Landed. Busy day ahead. Don't worry about anything. I've structured everything so you're completely secure." I looked at the screen for a long moment. Then I turned the phone face down. For 20 years, I had been the easiest person in his life to reassure. That was about to become his biggest mistake. I did not call anyone that afternoon. Not the bank, not a lawyer, not even my granddaughter. Panic makes people loud, and loud people miss details. I needed silence. At exactly 2:40 p.m., my phone rang again. Noelle. I let it ring twice before answering. Yes. Her voice was tighter now, controlled, like someone who had already crossed a line and couldn't step back. I can't send anything to your personal email. It's monitored through the firm's compliance filters. But there's a way we can speak safely. In person. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Where? There's a cafe on Whitmore Street. Small place, green awning. They serve something called pistachio affogato. I can be there in 40 minutes. Be there in 30, I said, already reaching for my coat. The drive felt longer than it was. Traffic lights seemed to hold just a second too long, as if the world itself wanted me to reconsider. But I didn't. I parked across the street and watched the cafe for a moment before stepping out. Habit. Observation. Another thing age teaches you. Noelle was younger than I expected. Late 20s, perhaps. Dark hair pulled into a tight knot. A face that hadn't yet learned how to hide what it felt. She stood when she saw me, nearly knocking her chair back. Mrs. Renford? Sit, I said calmly, taking the chair across from her. Start talking. She didn't order anything. Neither did I. For the past year, she began, lowering her voice, I've been handling internal reconciliation reports, not client-facing documents, the real ones, the ones that show movement before it's cleaned. Cleaned, I repeated. She nodded. Adjusted for presentation. Of course. Damien always loved presentation. She slid a thin folder across the table. No logos, no branding, just paper. I printed what I could without triggering alerts. These are partial logs. Evergreen is only one of several accounts. I opened it slowly. Rows of numbers, dates, transfer IDs, entity names I had never seen before. Varel Holdings, North Key Advisory, Sylvan Crest Limited. Elegant names, empty meanings. Look at the sequence here, she said, leaning forward slightly. Funds move out of your primary portfolio into Evergreen. Then within 48 hours, they're redirected again through these entities. After that, they disappear into pooled structures. By the time reports are generated for you, the numbers are stabilized, meaning fabricated, meaning curated, she said carefully. But yes, I traced one line with my finger. The date was familiar. This was right after I sold my husband's workshop. Noelle swallowed. That was one of the largest inflows. And he moved it. Not all at once. That would have been obvious. In layers. Of course he did. My son had always been patient. Even as a boy, he never grabbed. He arranged. I turned another page. Fees. Percentages. Small enough individually to feel reasonable. Together. Something else. Entirely. How long? I asked. She hesitated. How long has this been happening, Ms. Harrow? At least 7 years in this structure, possibly longer under different frameworks. 7 years. 7 years of sitting across from him, listening to his calm voice, nodding at numbers that no longer belonged to me. And you stayed, I said. Not accusing, just stating. Her jaw tightened. I didn't see the full pattern until recently. He compartmentalizes everything. No one person has the whole picture. She met my eyes then, except him. And now, perhaps, me. Why tell me? I asked. She exhaled slowly. Because yesterday he instructed me to prepare a full migration of your remaining liquid assets to a new jurisdiction. Once that happens, tracing anything becomes significantly harder. Lisbon. A fresh chapter. I closed the folder. Around us, people were laughing softly, spoons tapping porcelain, the faint scent of espresso drifting through the air. Ordinary life continuing, as it always does, even when something fundamental breaks. "How much is left?" I asked. Noel didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "Less than you think." "More than he expects you to notice." I nodded once. That was enough. I placed my hand flat on the folder, steady, deliberate. "From this moment on, Ms. Harrow, you will not warn me again. You will document. You will remember. And when the time comes, you will tell the truth." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're not going to confront him?" I allowed myself a small, thin smile. "No," I said. "I am going to understand him." I stood, leaving the untouched affogato melting slowly between us, and stepped back into the afternoon light. For the first time in years, I was not reacting to my son. I was studying him. By the next morning, I was already dressed before the sun had fully settled over the rooftops. Not in anything dramatic, just my charcoal coat, the one with the clean lines and deep pockets, and a silk scarf Alistair once brought me from Florence. There is a certain kind of armor that doesn't announce itself. It simply reminds you who you are. The bank opened at 9. I arrived at 8:35. Old habits. Control what you can. The glass doors reflected me back. A 76-year-old woman with steady hands and eyes that, for the first time in years, were not asking for reassurance. Inside, everything was familiar. Polished floors, quiet voices, the faint scent of coffee from a machine that had been in the same corner for at least a decade. "Mrs. Renford," the receptionist smiled. "You're early today." "I prefer it that way," I said. Within minutes, I was sitting across from Harold Whitaker, the senior account manager who had handled my affairs long before Damien inserted himself into the structure. Harold was in his 60s, meticulous, cautious, the kind of man who reads every line twice. "I understand you requested an urgent review," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I did," I replied, placing Noel's folder gently on the desk. "And I'd like you to look at this before you say anything reassuring." He opened it. I watched his face, not the papers. "That tells you more." At first, nothing. Professional neutrality. Then a slight tightening around the mouth. A pause that lasted a fraction too long. His fingers stopped turning pages. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "That's not your first concern, Harold." No answer. He continued reading. Slower now, more carefully. When he reached the transfer sequences, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "This doesn't match the client summaries," he said. "I'm aware. These entities," he tapped the page lightly, "they're not part of your declared structure. I'm aware of that too." Silence settled between us, heavy but controlled. Finally, he looked at me. Really looked this time. "How much do you know, Mrs. Renford?" "Enough to understand I've been managed, not advised." That landed. He closed the folder carefully, aligning the edges as if precision could restore order to what he'd just seen. "If this is accurate, your son has been operating beyond the authority granted in your official mandate." "Not beyond," I said calmly. "Within what I was convinced to sign." That was the difference. And he knew it. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We need to secure your position immediately." "Yes," I said. "We do." He turned to his computer, fingers moving faster now. "First, we restrict all external transfers from your primary accounts. Then we review any active authorizations." "Revoke them," I said. He hesitated. "That would include your son." "Especially my son." Another pause. Shorter this time. Understood. As he worked, I studied the room. The same paintings. The same quiet ticking clock. How many times had I sat here, comfortable, certain that everything was in order? How many times had I smiled politely while something essential was being rearranged behind my back? Mrs. Renford, Harold said carefully, once we initiate this, your son will be notified. He will likely contact you immediately. I folded my hands in my lap. He already believes I don't understand what he's doing. And now? I allowed myself a very small, very controlled smile. Now he's going to find out how wrong that is. Harold nodded once and pressed a final key. Transfers frozen. Authorizations under review. I'll need your signature for full revocation, but operationally, he's cut off for now. Cut off. Such a simple phrase. I stood, adjusting my scarf. Good. As I turned to leave, Harold spoke again. Mrs. Renford, this may become complicated, legally. I paused at the door. It already is, I said. I'm just the last person to acknowledge it. Outside, the morning air felt sharper, cleaner. For 20 years, my son had moved my life like pieces on a board I couldn't see. Now, the board was visible. And for the first time, I was the one making the next move. I did not even make it home before my phone started vibrating. Once. Twice. Then continuously, like something alive trying to claw its way through my handbag. I didn't look at it immediately. There is power in delay. When someone is used to access, silence becomes a message they don't know how to interpret. By the time I stepped into my house, placed my keys in the porcelain dish by the door, and removed my coat, there were already 9 missed calls. All from Damien. I set the phone on the kitchen table and went about my routine. Kettle, water, teacup. The same gestures as yesterday, but they felt different now. Deliberate, not automatic. I cut a slice of the cardamom loaf I had baked the day before. It had settled overnight, the spices deeper, richer. Funny how time improves some things and exposes others. The phone lit up again. I sat down, finally turned it over, and opened his latest message. Mother, call me. Immediately. No greeting, no warmth, just instruction. I almost smiled. Another message followed seconds later. There seems to be an issue with the accounts. I assume this is some kind of administrative error. I'll handle it, but I need you to confirm a few things. Of course. Frame it as a mistake. Keep control of the narrative. I took a slow sip of tea before typing a reply. I'm aware of the situation, Damien. I watched the screen. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Good. Then you understand there's no need for concern. These systems occasionally flag irregularities during transitional periods. I'll resolve it from here. From here, Lisbon. Distance had always been his preferred advantage. I typed again, slower this time. No, you won't. The typing dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, I don't think you fully understand what you're interfering with. There it was. Not concern, not confusion, annoyance. I leaned back in my chair, studying the message as if it were just another line in one of his reports. For 20 years, he had spoken to me in softened language, padded explanations, careful tones. Now, with the first barrier in place, the edge was already showing. Interesting. The phone rang again. This time, I answered. Mother. His voice came through, controlled but tighter than usual. What exactly have you done? I've corrected an oversight, I said calmly. You've frozen active structures, he replied, the words clipped. Do you have any idea what kind of complications that creates? I imagine the kind that require explanation. A pause. then softer, almost patient, the voice he used when he wanted compliance. You're reacting to incomplete information. If someone has been speaking to you— They have, I said. Silence. Who? He asked. That doesn't concern you. His breath shifted on the line. I could hear it now. Not panic, not yet, but something unsettled. A calculation no longer running clean. Mother, he said, slower now. We need to handle this carefully. There are processes you don't see, obligations you don't understand. And money that no longer belongs where you told me it was, I interrupted. Another silence. Longer. When he spoke again, the softness was gone. You're making a mistake. I looked down at my hands. Steady. Completely steady. No, I said. I've been making one for 20 years. I ended the call. The house was quiet again, but not empty. Not like before. There was something else in it now. Clarity, perhaps. Or consequence. My phone buzzed once more. A message this time. We need to discuss this in person. I'm booking a flight back. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached for the folder Noelle had given me and opened it again. This time, not as a shocked mother, but as something else entirely. A woman reviewing evidence. If Damien thought distance would protect him, he was already too late. He wasn't dealing with the version of me he had trained to trust him. He was dealing with the one who finally stopped. I did not wait for Damien to return before making my next move. By noon, I was seated in a quiet office on the 3rd floor of a sandstone building that had not changed its facade in 40 years. Heavy doors. Thick carpet. The kind of place where decisions are made slowly and recorded permanently. Gideon Vale did not waste time with pleasantries. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s perhaps, but his eyes had that particular stillness I've only ever seen in people who deal professionally with lies. He read Noelle's documents in silence, turning each page with deliberate care, occasionally making a small mark in the margin with a fountain pen so dark it was almost blue-black. I let him work. After 10 minutes, he closed the folder. This is not sloppy, he said. No, I replied. It never was. He leaned back slightly, studying me now instead of the paper. Your son didn't steal impulsively. He engineered a system. Layered, patient, legally insulated where possible. Where possible, I repeated. Yes. He tapped the folder lightly. And where not possible, he relied on your trust. There it was again. Not just money, structure. Betrayal dressed as competence. What can be recovered? I asked. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street for a moment before turning back. That depends on how far you're willing to go. I held his gaze. All the way. A flicker of approval passed through his expression. Subtle, but there. Then we start by mapping everything, he said. Every transfer, every entity, every authorization you signed, and more importantly, how those authorizations were used. He pulled a legal pad closer and began writing. Evergreen is one branch, he continued, but these— he pointed to the names on the page. Varel Holdings, North Key Advisory. These are conduits, likely shell structures. We'll need to trace ownership, jurisdiction, and control. I never approved those. You approved something, he said calmly. We just need to find the document that allowed him to make it look legitimate. That was the part that settled heavily, because I knew he was right. Damien had never forced anything. He had never needed to. He had guided, reframed, simplified, until my signature became a tool he could reuse. Gideon continued, faster now, the outline forming. We also freeze what we can immediately. You've already taken the first step at the bank, that's good, but there may be secondary access points. Investment platforms, custodial accounts, discretionary mandates. I want them all reviewed, I said. They will be. He paused, then added, and one more thing. I waited. If your son has already initiated a jurisdictional shift, Lisbon, for example, then part of this may move beyond straightforward recovery. At that point, it becomes exposure. Meaning we stop asking politely for things to be returned and start making it very difficult for him to continue operating. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger. Alignment. For 20 years, I said slowly, he believed I wouldn't look too closely, that I preferred comfort over clarity. Gideon gave a slight nod. That's a common assumption. He built everything on that. Yes. I folded my hands on the desk. Then let's remove that assumption. For the first time, Gideon smiled. Not warmly, not reassuringly, just precisely. Understood. He turned the page and wrote a single line across the top. Full trace and exposure strategy. From this point forward, he said, you don't speak to your son about details. No numbers, no accusations. Let him speculate. People make mistakes when they don't know what you know. I thought of Damien's voice on the phone. Controlled, certain, irritated but not yet afraid. Not yet. And when he comes back? I asked. Gideon capped his pen. Then, he said, we see how well he performs without control. I stood, gathering the folder, but something stopped me before I reached the door. One question, I said. He looked up. This trust my husband set up. For the family. Is it intact? Gideon's expression shifted, just slightly. That, he said carefully, is something we need to examine very closely. That was not the answer I wanted, but it was the answer I expected. I nodded once and left the office. Outside, the afternoon had deepened into something sharper, more defined. For the first time since Noelle's call, I understood the shape of what I was facing. This was not just about recovering money. It was about uncovering everything my son had been willing to sacrifice to take it. And I had a feeling. The worst part was still waiting for me. I knew it before he said it. You don't spend decades managing a household, a marriage, a life, without learning how to read what isn't being said. Gideon didn't need to explain anything further in that office. The hesitation in his voice had already done it for him. But I needed to see it myself. That afternoon, I returned home and went straight to the one place Damien never touched. Not because he respected it, but because he assumed it no longer mattered. Alistair's study. I hadn't changed it in years. The same walnut desk, the same brass lamp with the faint scratch along its base, the same cedar box tucked into the lower drawer, wrapped in a faded burgundy cloth. My husband believed in physical records. Paper doesn't lie, he used to say. People do. I sat down slowly and pulled the box into my lap. For a moment, I didn't open it. Grief has a way of living quietly inside objects. You don't disturb it unless you're ready for what comes with it. Then I unfolded the cloth. Inside were the original documents, the ones that existed before Damien simplified everything. The trust agreement, the asset allocations, the handwritten notes Alistair had made in the margins, precise and firm, as if even his thoughts needed structure. I found the trust first. The Renford family reserve. It was meant to be untouchable, a safeguard, something stable, something protected, not just for me, but for the family as a whole, for future stability, for dignity. I read the original terms carefully. Then I stood, carried the document to the kitchen, and laid it beside the copies Gideon had flagged, side by side, original, revised. At first glance, they looked identical. Same formatting, Same language, same reassuring tone Damien always used. But I wasn't glancing anymore. Line by line, clause by clause. And then I saw it. A modification buried in the middle of a paragraph that most people would skim. Something about discretionary liquidity reallocation under advisory authority. Clean, professional. Harmless, if you didn't know what it replaced. I flipped back to the original. That clause hadn't existed. In its place had been something very different. Principal assets shall remain protected from discretionary withdrawal except under explicitly documented beneficiary consent. Consent? Clear, direct, unambiguous. In the revised version, that word was gone, replaced, softened, opened. I felt my fingers tighten on the paper. This right here, this is where it turns. Not just money, legacy. If you were her, would you confront him immediately or keep digging? I went back to the transfer logs. Dates, amounts, cross-referenced against the trust. And there it was. Not one large withdrawal. Not something obvious. A slow bleed. Carefully timed reallocations that fell just within the widened authority of the revised clause. Enough to avoid triggering alarms. Enough to remain technically permissible. Enough to hollow it out. My husband's safeguard. Gone. Not recklessly. Not violently. Elegantly. I sat down. The document spread out in front of me like a map of something I had once trusted blindly. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I reached for my phone. There were new messages. Damien. 3 this time. We need to talk before this escalates. You're acting on incomplete information. Don't make this worse than it has to be. I read them once, then again. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to clarity sharpen into something colder. He still thought this was about damage control, about smoothing things over, about guiding me back into the version of reality he preferred. He didn't understand. Not yet. I placed the phone back on the table and looked down at the original document again. My husband's handwriting steady in the margins. Protected. That was the word he had chosen. Not optimized. Not restructured. Protected. I ran my fingers lightly over the page. I see it now, I said quietly, though there was no one there to hear it. Not just what Damien had done, but what he had been willing to do. There is a difference between taking advantage of someone's trust and dismantling the one thing that was never meant to be touched. And in that moment, something settled inside me with absolute certainty. This was no longer about recovery. This was about consequence. Damien didn't wait for permission. He arrived the next evening. No warning message this time. No polite request to schedule a conversation. Just the sound of tires on gravel outside my house, sharp and sudden, followed by the firm, impatient knock I remembered from when he was a teenager, demanding to be let in after curfew. I didn't rush to the door. I finished my tea first. Then I stood, smoothed the sleeve of my blouse, and walked to the hallway. When I opened it, he was exactly as I expected. Composed, tailored, controlled, dark coat, expensive watch, that same neutral expression he used in boardrooms and negotiations. To anyone else, he would have looked calm. To me, he looked adjusted. "Mother," he said. "Damien." He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, his eyes already scanning the room, taking inventory. That, more than anything, confirmed it. He wasn't here as a son. He was here as a man assessing risk. "You've caused quite a disruption," he said, removing his gloves with slow precision. "Accounts flagged, transfers halted, third parties asking questions." "I imagine they are." He turned to me, studying my face as if searching for something familiar. "You've always trusted me," he said. "So I'm going to assume this is the result of someone misinforming you." I didn't answer immediately. I walked past him into the living room and took my seat, folding my hands calmly in my lap. "You can sit, Damien," I said. He remained standing for a moment longer, then sat across from me, posture straight, controlled. "Who spoke to you?" he asked. "That's not your concern." "It is if they're interfering with structured financial operations." There it was again. Language. Always language. I tilted my head slightly. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes," he said evenly. "Because that's what it is." I let the silence stretch. People like Damien fill silence. They can't help it. And right on cue. "You're reacting emotionally," he continued, "which is understandable. These things can look complicated from the outside, but I assure you, everything has been handled within a professional framework." "Professional," I repeated softly. "Yes." I reached beside me and picked up the folder. Not the full set, just enough. Just a few pages. I placed them on the table between us. "Then explain these," I said. He glanced down, and for the first time since he walked in, something shifted. Small, precise, but real. His eyes moved across the page faster than they should have. Not reading, recognizing. "How did you get this?" he asked. "That's your second question," I said calmly. He looked up at me. And now, finally, there was something new in his expression. Not control, calculation. "This is internal material," he said carefully. "Taken out of context." "Then give it context." A pause. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, resetting. "Fine," he said. "Yes, funds were reallocated, strategically, to optimize returns, manage exposure, and ensure long-term growth. From my accounts, within your structure." "My structure," I repeated. "Or the one you created?" Another pause. "You authorized every adjustment," he said. There it was. The line he had been waiting to use. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." Relief flickered across his face. Brief. Controlled. But there. He thought that was his ground. I leaned forward slightly. "Under information you curated," I continued. "Under explanations you controlled. Under documents you revised." The relief disappeared, replaced by something tighter. "Be careful," he said quietly. "You're stepping into territory you don't fully understand." I held his gaze. "No," I said. "For the first time, I am stepping out of it." Silence. Heavy now. Real. He stood up suddenly, pacing once across the room before turning back to me. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Whatever you think you've found, we can resolve it. Quietly. Quietly, of course." That had always been his preferred environment. I shook my head once. "No." His jaw tightened. "You're making this public then?" "I haven't decided yet." "But you're considering it?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. Then he looked at me again, and whatever softness had once existed in him was gone. "Do you understand what that would do?" he asked. "To me. To the family." I stood up slowly, and for the first time since he entered the house, I stepped closer. Close enough that he had to look down slightly to meet my eyes. "Yes," I said. "That's the point." He didn't answer. Because now, finally, he understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something to smooth over. It wasn't something he could manage. It was something coming for him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling it. I did not rush what came next. That would have been his instinct, not mine. For 2 days, I said nothing publicly. No calls, no accusations, no emotional outbursts that could be dismissed as confusion or age. Instead, I sat at my dining table with Gideon's notes, Noelle's documents, and my husband's original records, building something far more dangerous than anger. A sequence. Every transfer aligned with a date. Every date tied to a document. Every document traced back to a moment where I had been guided, reassured, or deliberately misinformed. It was meticulous work. Slow, precise. The kind of work that doesn't shout. It proves. By the end of the second day, I had something Damien would recognize immediately. Not suspicion. Structure. That evening, I made 3 calls. The first was to Gideon. "It's ready," I said. A brief pause. "Then we proceed." The second was to Harold at the bank. "I need a certified summary of all account movements over the past 10 years, I told him. "Nothing adjusted, nothing simplified." "You'll have it by morning," he said without hesitation. The third call was the most important. To the Renford Memorial Foundation. My late husband had established it 15 years ago. A quiet institution. Grants, scholarships, small but respectable gatherings. The kind of place where people with reputations came to maintain them, including Damien. There was an annual board evening scheduled in 3 days. Private, formal, predictable. Perfect. "I'd like to attend," I told the coordinator. A warm, surprised tone came through the line. "Of course, Mrs. Renford. It would be wonderful to have you there. I'll be bringing updated financial documents regarding the family reserve," I added. A pause. "Understood." I ended the call and set the phone down carefully. This would not be a scene, not shouting, not confrontation in the crude sense. No. This would be presentation. Damien had built his life on controlled perception. Curated numbers, curated language, curated impressions. So I chose the one place where perception mattered most. And I prepared to take control of it. The night before the event, Damien called again. I let it ring. Then again. Then again. On the 4th call, I answered. His voice was different now, less polished, more direct. "What are you planning?" he asked. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the evening settle over the garden. "Attending a family obligation." "Don't do this," he said immediately. No softness this time. No performance. "Whatever you think you've built, you don't understand the consequences. I understand them perfectly. You'll destroy everything." I allowed myself a small pause before answering. "Not everything," I said. Silence. Then, sharper. "You think they'll take your side? Based on what? Documents you don't even fully comprehend?" I looked down at the folder resting on my lap. "I don't need them to take my side," I said calmly. "I need them to see yours." His breathing shifted. There it was again. Not control, not certainty. Pressure. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm correcting one." I ended the call before he could answer. The next evening, I stood in front of my mirror. Dark blue dress. The same one I had worn years ago to an event Damien had once called important. Low heels, simple pearls, nothing excessive. Nothing that could be dismissed. I did not want to look powerful. I wanted to look undeniable. I picked up the folder. Then another, thinner, but more dangerous. The original trust. My husband's handwriting. I placed both into my bag. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, sharp with the faint scent of rain. The car was already waiting. As I got in, I allowed myself one final moment of stillness. For 20 years, my son had spoken in rooms like the one I was about to enter. Confident, respected, untouched. Tonight, he would not be the one controlling the narrative. And for the first time since this began, I was not walking into uncertainty. I was walking into proof. The Renford Memorial Foundation had always favored restraint, soft lighting, polished wood. Conversations kept just below the level of intrusion. It was not a place for noise. It was a place for impressions, the kind that lingered long after the evening ended. When I entered, no one noticed immediately. That was fine. I didn't come to be announced. I came to be seen. Damien was already there. Of course he was. Standing near the center of the room, speaking to two board members, his posture relaxed, voice measured, hand movements precise. Anyone watching him would see a man entirely in control of his environment. For a moment, I simply observed. 20 years of practice, 20 years of performance. Then I began walking, not toward him directly, toward the table. The long central table where documents were usually reviewed during formal discussions, where numbers mattered more than charm. A few heads turned as I approached. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. Mrs. Renford. A chair shifted. Someone stood. Damien noticed the change before he saw me. His body stilled mid-sentence. Then he turned, and for the first time since I had known him as a boy, he did not know what to say. I gave him a small nod. Damien. Mother, he replied, but the word didn't land the way it used to. Not here. Not now. I set my bag on the table and opened it calmly. I apologize for the interruption, I said, addressing the room, not him. But there are financial matters regarding the family reserve that require clarification. That got their attention. Not drama, not accusation. Clarification. The most dangerous word in a room full of people who rely on trust. Damien stepped forward slightly. This isn't the place for... It is exactly the place, I said, still calm, given that this foundation is directly tied to the integrity of those funds. A pause. No one stopped me. That was important. I removed the first set of documents, the certified summaries Harold had prepared. Clean, precise, undeniable. Then the second, my husband's original trust. I placed both side by side. Over the past several days, I continued, I've conducted a review of my financial structures, specifically the Renford family reserve. I did not look at Damien. I didn't need to. I discovered discrepancies, I said. Significant ones. A murmur moved through the room, quiet, controlled, but present. Damien's voice cut through it. These are internal matters, he said. There's no need to... There is every need, I replied, finally turning to him. And this time, I held his gaze. Because what you've called internal affects every structure tied to this name. Silence. Heavy now. I picked up the first document. Certified account movement, I said, placing it in front of the nearest board member. Unadjusted. 10 years. Then the second. Original trust terms. Handwritten notes included. And finally, I placed Noelle's extracted logs between them. And the operational layer used to move those funds. No explanation beyond that. I didn't need to interpret. The numbers would do it. One of the board members, an older man with a reputation for precision, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He didn't speak. He read. Another followed, then another. The room shifted. Not loudly, but definitively. Damien moved closer now, his voice lower, controlled but tighter than before. You're misrepresenting technical reallocations, he said. These are standard. Then explain them, I said. He stopped. Because now, he couldn't simplify. Not here. Not with documents in front of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. Seconds passed, long enough to matter. Someone at the table spoke quietly. This clause was altered. Another voice. These transfers that weren't disclosed in the summaries. And then, the one thing Damien had avoided his entire life. Not confrontation, not anger, but scrutiny. He looked at me again, and this time there was no performance left. Just calculation, failing to keep up. You should have come to me first, he said quietly. I tilted my head slightly. I did, I replied. For 20 years. That was the moment it broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Because now, in that room, he wasn't the architect. He was the subject. And there was nothing left for him to control. No one raised their voice after that. That's what people misunderstand about moments like these. They expect shouting, accusations, something theatrical. But real damage, the kind that doesn't heal, happens quietly, in rooms where everyone suddenly understands something they can't unsee. The documents stayed on the table, and people kept reading. No one gave Damien the courtesy of looking at him anymore. That was the shift. I stepped back slightly, not retreating, just removing myself from the center. This was no longer about me presenting anything. It was about them seeing it for themselves. One of the trustees cleared his throat. Damien, he said, measured, controlled. These reallocations, why were they not disclosed in the official summaries? No immediate answer. Another voice followed, sharper. And this clause. A finger tapped the page. This modification significantly expands discretionary authority. When was this approved? Still nothing. I watched my son. For years I had seen him navigate rooms like this effortlessly. He knew when to speak, when to deflect, when to soften, when to dominate. But that required one thing he no longer had. Control of the narrative. He stepped forward finally, placing his hand lightly on the table as if grounding himself. These are internal structuring decisions, he said. Complex, but entirely within operational scope. You're looking at fragments without understanding the full strategy. A familiar approach, reframe, complicate, dilute. But it didn't land. Because now, there were too many eyes on the same page. The older trustee, the one who had spoken first, leaned back slowly. I've spent 40 years reviewing financial structures, he said. This isn't complexity. A pause. This is concealment. That word settled heavier than anything else that had been said. Damien's jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation. So are undisclosed movements of this scale, another voice replied. Across the room, I noticed Celeste. She hadn't spoken yet. She stood near the far end of the table, her posture rigid, her expression carefully neutral. But her eyes kept moving between the documents and Damien. This was new to her, too. Not the behavior, the exposure. And then I saw Lila. My granddaughter stood slightly apart from the others, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face pale but steady. She wasn't looking at the papers. She was looking at her father, waiting. That, more than anything, broke something invisible in the room. Because there are consequences you can argue your way through, and then there are the ones that look back at you. Damien saw her, just for a second. And in that second, he hesitated. That was all it took. Gideon's voice entered the room then, calm and precise. If I may, he said, stepping forward from where he had been standing quietly along the wall. Several heads turned. My name is Gideon Vale. I represent Mrs. Renford in this matter. Damien's eyes snapped toward him. Of course. He hadn't expected that. Gideon placed a thin document on the table. A preliminary trace analysis, he continued. We are currently mapping full exposure, but even at this stage, there is sufficient evidence of unauthorized redirection of funds under misrepresented authority. Unauthorized? Damien repeated, sharper now. Everything was signed? Signed, Gideon agreed. Yes. He paused. Under materially incomplete disclosure. Silence. Clean. Final. That was the difference between suspicion and structure. Damien looked around the room again, but this time, no one was waiting for him to explain. They were waiting for him to answer, and he had nothing left that sounded like truth. I stepped forward then, just enough to be seen again. Not as the center, as the origin. For years, I said, my voice steady, I believed I was being protected. No one interrupted. I believed my son was preserving what his father built, that he was managing, not taking. I let the words sit there. Taking. But this, I gestured lightly toward the documents, is not management. I looked at Damien, and for the first time, there was no distance left between us. No roles, no titles, just truth. This is removal. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to adjust. Nothing left to reframe. The room had already decided what it was seeing. I turned slightly, my gaze moving to Lila. She hadn't moved, but her expression had changed. Not confusion anymore, not even shock. Understanding, quiet, permanent. And that was the moment I knew. Whatever happened next, whatever could be recovered, whatever would be lost. Something far more important had already shifted. Not in the accounts, not in the documents, but in the one place Damien had never accounted for, where perception becomes judgment, and judgment doesn't reverse. The room did not recover. It didn't return to conversation or diplomacy or polite distance. Something had shifted too deeply for that. People didn't argue. They recalibrated, quietly, permanently. I gathered my documents without rushing. No one stopped me. That, more than anything, told me how complete it was. Behind me, voices began again, low, controlled, but different now. Questions, not assumptions. Verification, not trust. Damien's name spoken not as authority, but as subject. I didn't turn around. There was nothing left for me in that room. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Not because it was simple, it wasn't, but because once structure collapses, people who once benefited from silence become very efficient at clarifying truth. Accounts were reviewed. Accesses were formally revoked. Several entities tied to the transfers were flagged and frozen pending investigation. Not everything could be recovered. Money rarely travels backward willingly, but enough remained within reach to matter. What couldn't be returned was documented, and documented truth has a way of following a person longer than money ever could. Damien tried, once, to speak to me again. A message? Not the tone he used before. Shorter, stripped. We need to resolve this. I read it, then I deleted it. Some things don't get resolved, they get concluded. A week later, I sat at my kitchen table again, same place. Same light, but nothing felt the same. In front of me were new documents. Clean ones. Transparent. Reviewed by Gideon, executed with full clarity. A restructuring. Not for optimization, for protection. The remaining estate, the assets I had secured and the portions we managed to recover, all of it was redirected into a controlled trust, not broad, not flexible, not open to interpretation, clear, irrevocable, and for the first time in 20 years, defined by me. Lila sat across from me, quiet, watching. She had come the day after the foundation evening. No drama, no accusations, just a presence that didn't try to fix anything. I don't want his version of things, she had said simply. I want yours. So I gave it to her. Not softened, not rewritten. The truth. Now, she looked at the documents as I slid them toward her. This is for you, I said. Her eyes lifted. Grandma? It's not a gift, I interrupted gently. It's responsibility. She hesitated. What about? Your father made his choices, I said. No anger, just fact. And now I've made mine. She nodded slowly. Understanding doesn't always come with comfort, but it stays. That evening, after she left, I stood by the window for a long time. The garden looked the same. The hydrangeas were still there. The light still fell the same way across the yard. But I wasn't the same woman who had stood here 12 days ago, holding a phone and trying to understand how everything could disappear without a sound. Nothing had disappeared. It had been taken. Quietly. Carefully. Professionally. And I had allowed it. Because I trusted the wrong person for the right reason. Family. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. There is a difference between being kind and being blind. I had spent years confusing the two. Not anymore. I'll say it straight. I wouldn't have waited this long. But she did it right. Quiet, precise, final. And tell me honestly, would you forgive him after this? If you made it this far, you already know. Not every betrayal looks loud. Sometimes it's polished, patient, and sits right across from you at your own table. If this story hit you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and write in the comments. What would you have done in her place?